Good afternoon, everyone. May I just say to begin with what an absolute pleasure and a privilege it is to be speaking with you this afternoon. As I'm glad Kurt was quick to point out, I am not a designer, as the following PowerPoint presentation will prove to you. But rather than framing it as an apology, I'd like to think of it more as a gift to you, so that you can feel justifiably superior, because everyone in this room would do a better job of a PowerPoint deck than what I've been able to do. So my gift to you, you're welcome. Design for the next context. So the title for this presentation came from a quote that came to my attention almost exactly a year ago through a former colleague of mine, Dan Hill. Some of you might have come across his work. And it comes from the modernist architect Eliel Saarinen, who said, "Always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan." And when I first read those words, I think a penny dropped for me, because I had been working at the intersection of futures or foresight and design for 5 or so years already. And it occurred to me that most of the work that I had seen designers doing in groping towards this kind of big D idea of design, the sort of Bruce Mau massive change, the design of the world, not the world of design type of idea about design, most of that was coming at it more often from a spatial perspective. That is, the chair in the room, in the house, in the environment. And as a futurist, of course, the principal means by which we ply our trade is by having people look at things in the next temporal context. And I realize, of course, that that is also of enormous interest and even kind of intrinsic, that it's actually built into the work that you do. But it has been my observation, working with designers and teaching futures to them for the past little while, that generally the tools and language and methods of futures are less widely used than they really ought to be. And I'm channeling Cameron Tonkinwise, who earlier today in his session made the point that, and I made the same point in my doctoral dissertation, that futurists and designers are in effect doing the same thing at different scales, that designers are working the future into materiality by increments, and futurists are attempting to do the same thing, but at a larger, industry or city or even world scale. But so, for that reason, it really behooves all of you, I would say, and all of us, to whatever extent we do design, to consider our designs in the next temporal context. And so the task I've set for myself this afternoon is, rather than giving you a lecture about that, to provide 3 stories that in some way triangulate to this question of what the next temporal context is and how we can approach it more effectively. Now, I want to start with this bone-simple kind of thought diagram, which we could call the cone of possibility. Now, I didn't invent this. It's been floating around for about 15 or 20 years in different forms. But what it captures and makes really vivid for people, I find, is that if we consider this, the apex at the left-hand side, to be the present moment, it is a moment of pure actuality and zero potential, because there's nothing you can do in this moment to change this moment. All potential spans out from it into the future as you follow the time axis off to the right. And the thing about the cone is that it expands as time goes on. So the further out in time you go, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour or 50 years, the more possibilities at each moment later there are for the way the world could be configured than in the moment before. And that helps us understand, I think, why it is so difficult to think in a concrete way about what the future could look like the further out in time we go. So if I asked you to describe for me how Phoenix, let's say, might look tomorrow, you'd probably not have too much difficulty with that. If I asked you to do the same thing vis-a-vis Phoenix 30 years from now, it might be a little bit more tricky, because it becomes manifestly obvious the further out in time you go that possibility is plural. And I'd say that's the first and most important lesson of thinking about the next design for the next context, as that next context multiplies in its potential as time goes on. Okay, so to those three stories that I promised you, the first one really comes from the fact that, well, I'm actually moving back to Australia in just a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be very sad to be leaving this country in San Francisco, where I live in particular. But I'll be continuing to work with out of the Melbourne office there, but as sort of by way of a farewell tour of the US, I suppose. About a month ago, I went on a road trip with a good friend of mine. We've road tripped before. He lives in Chicago. And this time we did a tour of what he calls America's forehead. So it was kind of the upper part of the Midwest. So we went up through Minnesota, Wisconsin, a little bit of Illinois, and a little bit in Michigan. We drove all the way across South Dakota and then all the way back across North Dakota. And so this first story comes from Deadwood, which is in the southwest corner of South Dakota. And now, that part of the country is actually extraordinarily rich, at least from my point of view, in interesting things to see and do. There's, of course, the Badlands, which are one of the most fascinating and bizarre landscapes that I've ever come across. There's Mount Rushmore, and of course, what self-respecting fan of Alfred Hitchcock and North by Northwest can resist taking a stupid photo? And then there is Deadwood, which I don't know how many people here are familiar with the HBO series, but to my mind, it's one of the crowning achievements of television of all time. It's absolutely amazing, incredibly well scripted. Sure, give Deadwood a cheer. I mean, why the hell not? And I really wanted to visit Deadwood, but I was slightly apprehensive about it, because in some ways I didn't want to have that Disneylandified experience of it being a simulacrum, a reference to a reference to a reference to a reference of a historical reality that may or may not ever have happened. And I don't know, I guess I was reluctantly prepared to be disappointed about that experience. But we went to Deadwood, and I'll tell you what happened. So, Matt's wife has some family in that part of the world. He'd been there before, and so he knew that there was at least one place in the main drag where we could have, where we'd be able to meet people who were under retirement age. And so we went into this particular saloon, which the claim to fame of which is that it's where Wild Bill Hickok was shot. And right over the door, as you walk in, there is indeed a shrine, in effect, to Wild Bill Hickok and his death chair that he was shot in. Now, the thing about Deadwood is, and I didn't even realize this when I was watching the series, but it's actually, it is a real place. I didn't know that at the time, and so, that's what intrigued me about visiting it when I found out that it was real. But when you go there, it's recognizably the place that you see, that they replicated on a set in a backlot in Burbank or someplace, because it's a wide main street with buildings only 2 or 3 stories tall, and sort of nestled in the Black Hills at either end. And so it's recognizably the place that you know and love from the TV series. And of course, the thing about Deadwood is that its main industry is fun, which means gaming. Gambling, slot machines in particular. And this was sort of an element of, for want of a better word, tackiness that sort of disappointed me, I have to say, right from the get-go when we drove in. But be that as it may, we went into the saloon determined to have some kind of a good time, but not knowing really what was in store. I'll explain this image in just a moment. So what we did was ordered a whiskey and a beer and a whiskey and a beer and etc. At some point we got hungry and were directed to the Italian steakhouse. Took me a while to figure this out, but Italian means Italian and steakhouse means restaurant. So we went upstairs and had some food and came back down and played at the tables for a while. And it was great. They had the kind of eye-in-the-sky security thing, but it wasn't that sort of incredibly self-serious, money-oriented type of gaming experience that can often make casinos seem so icky. It was, the dealers were only at the table like for 20 minutes at a time, and there were only 4 of them. So after sitting there for an hour and a half, steadily losing $2 at a hand each time, we'd basically met all of them, and they were really friendly, and they insisted on looking at our cards and helping us place bets, because all of these games, 3-card poker, which I'd never actually heard of before, and blackjack, as long as you're not cheating, the house is going to win regardless. So anyway, it was a great time, and then at the end of the night where they closed down the gaming part, the band that had been playing had stopped playing, and we were standing at the bar, and engaged in conversation with a couple of local of women from the town who were speaking to my friend Matt. And I didn't know this until the following day, but it turns out they somehow had got it into their heads that we were with the band. And obviously we weren't, but he let them think that because it seemed to, to be a basis for a conversation. I don't know why he did that. At any rate, that's where we were. And so when they finally turfed us out with our final beer, we said, well, where are we going to go? And one of the women said, well, why don't we go to where I work? So where I work turned out to be a block away in a totally deserted car park with a flight of stairs up to a small landing, and we sat there drinking beer for a while. And then after a little while, one of them produced this baggie with the extremely unpromising insignia on it here. And she assured us that she had a felony charge out against her and a small child, and she wasn't going to do anything illegal. So this was homeopathic speed, apparently, and produced I was questioning the wisdom of sharing this story with you, but I'm glad you guys are rolling with it. That's great. Anyway, one thing led to another, and the next thing was that all of a sudden, there was me, my friend, these two women, and a guy in his mid-20s, let's call him Jesse, who kind of had a young Marky Mark type thing going on. And they all pulled out knives. And they weren't threatening us, they were just showing us that they have knives, which was interesting. And so Matt said, oh, can I take a picture of a knife? And yeah, so he got and no faces and whatever, but we got a picture of everybody with their knives. And I note in particular that wonderful feminine pink-handled shiv on the left there, which was kind of an education all in itself. And so, we were looking at the knives, and I was kind of marveling at this experience we were having, and then Jesse, as we'll call him, says, oh, you think that's cool? And he pulls out a gun, and it's loaded. And he says, it's cool, and he's not threatening us. He's just showing us that he has a gun, because, he's a guy, and he's got a gun. And so Matt's like, ooh, can I take a picture of the gun? So there's an anonymized photograph of the occasion. But the question had to arise, why is this guy carrying a gun? And the answer is that because he carries $60,000 or $70,000 around with him everywhere he goes. And why, pray tell, would that be? Well, because he works for one of the gaming companies. And so he's empowered to, resolve disputes up to $2,000 or $3,000 or something, kind of make things go away if the machines aren't paying out properly. That's his job. Would you like to see the money? Sure, yeah, let's see the money. So within a minute, his friend pulls up in the deserted parking lot in a white minivan, opens the passenger side, and on the passenger seat is a small silver briefcase, which he opens up. Lo and behold, it's full of wadges of cash. And we probably should have been worried at this point, but we weren't. And Matt said, oh, can I take a photo of the wadges of cash? And the guy's like, don't put me in, I won't take a picture of you. So he got a photo of the wadges of cash. Anyway, where could the evening go from here? Guns, drugs, knives, gambling. As we walked back to the main street, really, it could only go downhill. So as we walked back to the main street, it was totally deserted. We got a shot of me standing there. We freaking closed down Deadwood. We closed it down. And the thing is, I had worried that we wouldn't have an authentic experience. But we did. We did have an authentic experience. And here's the thing, there is no way that we could have planned that. There is no way that we could have designed that. It's just what happened. The second story is from Hawaii. Now, I moved to Hawaii in 2005 to start my work as a graduate student in the Futures Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which also has the only doctoral program in futures in this country. And so I went there having visited Hawaii only once previously when I was 6 years old, and I was a little disappointed, to be honest, because one of the things that strikes you when you go to Oahu, right, I'm talking about Honolulu in particular, is that it's it's kind of a concrete wonderland, you know, and it's like the worst excesses, if I can put it this way, of Southern California urbanism have just been transplanted to the middle of the Pacific. And the supply of electricity is 95%, it turns out, from oil. Turbines that are turned by burning oil, and Hawaii doesn't have any oil of its own, so that's actually imported on oil-burning tankers, and 90% of the food that's consumed in Hawaii is also imported. And interestingly, the pre-European population of Hawaii is not a lot less than it is today, but of course it was entirely self-sufficient. So in 2005, happily, the Hawaii State Legislature was starting to think about sustainability. What an excellent idea, really, and I say that without irony. What an excellent idea, better late than never. And so they approached us, the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, which is kind of the consulting wing of the graduate program there that I was working for. And we had this challenge of how do you get people who are busily dealing with all of the, you know, urgent trivia of everyday life, you know, paying off the mortgage, taking the kids to soccer, putting dinner on the table, how do you get them thinking half a century ahead? And taking that seriously, how can it compete with the urgencies of from day to day? And so the process that the state wanted to undertake was called Hawaii 2050, and it was intended to be a statewide planning process towards a statewide participatory futuring process towards a sustainability plan. And what we decided to do in order to get people into the mind space of dealing with the middle of the 21st century was, rather than the conventional approach in futures or foresight work, which would be to kind of produce and disseminate written scenarios only, we still wrote the scenarios, but we translated them into experiences that people could have at the kickoff event. And so there were 530 people who showed up, and they were put each into, or in groups of 4, each group into a different version of 2050, an experience that they could have lasting about half an hour that would give them something to think with, something to feel with about what that future could be like. And so this is the beautiful Hawaii, and now I'm going to show you the first of those experiences. Now, this was a debate between 2 candidates in the gubernatorial election, live on stage in 2050. And the candidates are both corporations, because governments in this future are run for profit by corporate entities, you know, the corporate personhood having been extended to the point where regular individuals just don't actually run for anything anymore. And so through the stump speeches that the human avatars of the corporate candidates gave, you got a pretty good sense of how Hawaii had continued to grow and grow in terms of consumption, production, building across the islands, the growth of population. That was room number 1. The second room, when people walked in, they were ushered in by uniformed guards who were wearing what looked like camo gear, but on a second glance it turned out to be aloha print, so it sort of had hibiscuses and ferns in camouflage colors. And the people, they watched a brief video which gave them a potted history of Hawaii from prior to European contact up until just a few years before, 2050. And it explained that, that there had been a global economic meltdown, and that the rump of the US military, those who hadn't fled to the mainland, had stepped up to maintain law and order and ration goods and fuel and that sort of stuff. And they'd reinstated the Hawaiian monarchy. So this was a naturalization ceremony for the democratic Kingdom of Hawaii, which was actually not particularly democratic because it was basically a military state with a thin veneer of local legitimacy. But that was the second room. The third room was what we called the Honolulu Ahupua'a Civic Education Center. Now, Ahupua'a is a well-known term in Hawaii to denote the pre-European arrival way in which political boundaries were organized. That is to say that the watershed. So whatever fed you from the land, the mountains down to the sea, the ecological boundary and the political one were the same. And so in this version of 2050, there had been a return to that idea. and the people in the room had been selected at random, like jury duty, to undertake a crash course in various key sustainability skill sets. And so, like manufacturing clothes out of hemp or producing biofuel from algae. So that was the third experiential scenario. And then the fourth, we kind of conceived as a cross between a hospital emergency room and an automotive repair shop. We called it MBED, the Mind Body Enhancement Depot. And what these guys in white lab coats explained to the assembled mass was that the World Council had been monitoring the Global Happiness Index, and that pre-mods are just dragging down the averages. So flesh and blood humans are the least happy segment of the population. They're bumming everyone else out, and the World Council is going to pay for them to have post-human upgrades in order to set things right. So each of those scenarios corresponds to a different theory of change. Grow, collapse, discipline, transform. And the scenarios were devised with my colleague Jake Dunnigan, who's now at Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, and Jim Dater, who founded and runs the program in Hawaii. But what Jake and I went on to do after that was a whole series of interventions, some of them official, some of them more guerrilla style, in which we created artifacts from various futures and left them lying around for people to find, as a way of inviting them or prompting them to think more deeply about what various futures could feel like to inhabit. And one of those was in Chinatown, Honolulu, a series of interventions which manifested different futures for Chinatown. One of them was gentrification, as you can see in these images here. We also dramatized the other side of that story with a Save Chinatown rally outside an ostensible Starbucks location. And they gave out literature describing the whole situation. Second scenario was about a China that's going green and becoming a geopolitical superpower in a situation where the US is kind of persisting with its customary lack of interest in those priorities. And so this is called the Statue of Harmony, which is Sun Yat-sen and the Chinese revolutionary who went to school in Hawaii, and Queen Liliuokalani, the last Hawaiian monarch who was deposed in 1893, together holding up a torch. It's a gift from the Chinese people to Hawaii. And so these elements of alternative futures were distributed in the environment for people to encounter. The third one in Chinatown was was a bird flu outbreak in 2016. And we told that story right from the outbreak, those posters of the missing wall, people looking for their loved ones, through to the emergency measures undertaken by health authorities, and finally the memorialization of the whole story with this bronze plaque dated 2017. And the reason I mention that story, the Hawaii one, is because that is really how I came to futures and design, because to the intersection, because futures or foresight has existed as a field for getting on to around half a century, about 50 years, but it has not made a particularly strong mainstream impact on how people think about the future. And we felt it was necessary to manifest these ideas, make them compelling, make them unavoidable, make them irresistible. And so the third and final story that I want to share with you is not from my own experience. Perhaps you've heard it before. I got it from Alan Watts. And it takes place in China. And it's about a farmer who is not a wealthy man, and he owns a horse. And one day the horse runs away. And the villagers, his neighbors, hear about this, and they gather around him and say, wow, that's some really bad luck. I'm sorry about that. You're an unlucky guy. And the farmer says, maybe. Well, so a couple of days later, he's out in the fields, and he looks over the hill, and there's something coming over the horizon, and it's his horse, but it's not alone. There are 5 other horses with it, 5 other wild horses that it's been running with, and it comes back right onto his property. And the villagers hear about this. I mean, he doesn't have 0 horses or 1 horse, now he has 6, and they say, you, my friend, are a lucky guy. And he says, maybe. Well then, so a little while later, his son, his only son, one-child policy, is out breaking in one of these horses, and he's thrown off and breaks his leg. And he's useless for farming. I mean, he can't contribute. He's going to be laid up in bed for weeks. And the villagers hear about that, and they say, wow, that's some really bad luck. And the farmer says, maybe. Well, then just a little while after that, there's a knock at the door. And it's officers from the Red Army going around in the village and conscripting all of the young men of a certain age in order to take them off to fight whoever they were fighting at this point. And the army doctor checks the bedridden son and finds his leg's broken and he can't move. He can't be conscripted. He's going to stay home. Now, the villagers hear about this, and you can imagine what they say. Wow, well, my friend the farmer, aren't you a lucky guy? And do you know what he says? Correct. You guys are pretty sharp. And the moral of the story, if we must have a moral, the moral of the story is that you never know where progress lies. Because anything that unfolds puts everything that came before it in a totally different light. And the reason I tell that story is because I think it's actually the single most devastating argument against futures, and I like to look the most difficult things squarely in the face and admit to the complexities of doing this type of work. But between the three of them, so what? What's the point of these three stories? I've told the one about the madcap adventure in Deadwood, and the one about coming to this intersection of foresight and design through the Hawaii 2050 project and the ensuing experiments in experiential scenarios. And then this story about the Chinese farmer who always reserves judgment on whether something is for the best or the worst. Well, I think there is a thread between the three, and it actually occurred to me yesterday. I was reading the Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, and I was just struck by this incredible quote. I think it's in the 7th or 8th letter, and he says this: "We must accept our reality as vastly as we possibly can. Everything, even the unprecedented, must be possible within it. This, in the end, is the only kind of courage that is required of us, the courage to face the strangest, most unusual, most inexplicable experiences that can meet us." And to me, I think, there is a whole suite of methods and tools and things about futures that I could be giving you a lecture about, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted instead to talk primarily about this dispositional question of what we can do to meet design in the next, to meet and design in the next context as smoothly as possible. And so if we revisit this question, this sort of thought diagram of the cone of possibility, and we see that the number of potential worlds that we could find ourselves in very quickly becomes completely unmanageable. But it's also clear from those stories, I think, that it's not a question of exhaustively examining every single option that can be out there and being prepared for every single one of them. This is a way that some futurists talk about the multiplicity of possibilities. They talk about the edges of that cone being the bounds of the possible. And then within that, a subset of scenarios are the probable. And I know there are probably some people here who may think that because I'm a futurist, that what I do is spout predictions about how the world will change and expect you to be very impressed. Well, I don't do that. My interest in this work is primarily about working together with other people who know their domains of expertise far better than I ever will. And for us to learn something with each other about what the bounds of possibility hold and portend, because they are constantly changing. They're constantly changing. And then within that, the probable and the preferable. The idea is that if you can map the probable and the preferable within the bounds of the possible on an ongoing basis, then you are in an ideal position, or as ideal as you can be, to try to merge the probable with the preferable and make the future that you would like to see happen eventuate. And so I want to suggest that in the same way that a mindful design process can kind of provide a context for making things, for hacking, for producing, that futures as a suite, as an overall way of thinking, can similarly provide a step out beyond the confines of design thinking per se, to provide a more systematic as well as creative exploration of the range of possible worlds that we could find ourselves in, so that we can design for those. And I guess the argument here is that, as I've highlighted in the first and the third stories, it's not that we're always going to get it right. And it's not that we, by mapping this range of possibilities, make ourselves immune to surprise. But what it does do is give us a chance to anticipate as best we can to the extent that that is humanly possible. And then when we can't, and when we are surprised, to change, to adapt, to pivot, and react faster than we possibly could have any other way. So I'll leave you with a thought from my favorite writer, Kurt Vonnegut, who has one of his characters say in the novel Slapstick, "History is merely a list of surprises. It can only prepare us to be surprised yet again." Thank you.